Hello, I'm Roy, and you are checking out Roy's Book Reviews. This is the fourth video that I'm filming, and in it I will be discussing my thoughts on the novel A Brief History of Seven Killings by Marlon James. As usual, I will be borrowing from the words of my written review on Goodreads, plus throwing in some thoughts that pop into my head as I go along. Okay, so there is a lot going on in this novel, and I have to admit, I found it to be a challenging read. I read a lot of literary fiction, more so than genre books. So my reading is pretty varied. So I read a little bit of everything, but most of the books I read probably fall into the category of literary fiction, which means I'm accustomed to books where that are not so much plot oriented, but the poetry of the language is really critical to the experience and the enjoyment of the book. Even so, some literary novels go down smoother than others, and this one took a little while for me to get into. Much of the plot of the storyline takes place in Jamaica. You may have visited Jamaica in the past. I actually have a trip to Jamaica coming up next year for my sister's wedding, but that's neither here nor there. But as a result of it being set on a beautiful tropical island, you may consider it to be a beach read. It most definitely is not your traditional beach read, which basically means to people that it's pretty light and easy, and you don't have to put too many brain cells, I suppose, into reading it because it's just smooth sailing. I don't really subscribe to most literary labels that publishers come up with to market their product. I read whatever I want to read whenever I want to read it, and I think lying on a towel or sitting in a chair on the beach on a beautiful day is as wonderful a setting to read a challenging literary novel as it is to read, a much fluffier one. So, no book to me needs to be or needs not to be a beach read. This one, A Brief History of Seven Killings, is told from the vantage point of multiple characters, each of them telling their own story. Each of the stories are related to the build-up to a failed attempt on the life of Bob Marley and the aftermath of that event. Um, I have to say that I considered stopping once or twice because I was having trouble getting into the book. One of the reasons, because the use of Jamaican dialect for many of the characters. It's one thing to be hearing it; it's another thing to be reading it. So it took me a while just to kind of comprehend what people were saying some of the times. But a bigger part of the challenge or certain chapters, fortunately not too many of them, were written in a stream of consciousness style, really long sentences without a lot of punctuation. And that style of writing tends to wear me out a little bit because you can kind of lose track in where a sentence is going halfway through if it's too long. But I kept my reading momentum going because there was something gripping about the narrative that had me hooked, even though I was having a little bit of trouble falling into its pace. But eventually I did. And the setting of the book does eventually leave Jamaica behind and moves to New York during the crack epidemic years. Um, I found this portion of the book easier reading than the earlier part for some reason. Maybe because by then I'd read so much that I was used to the way people spoke in it. Or maybe just, I don't know, maybe I just had finally fallen into the flow of the writing and wanted to see where it was going to go. Also, I happen to have grown up in the Bronx, so I had a familiarity with the setting in the latter part of the book. Before coming to the Bronx, I actually lived on a tropical island myself, St. Thomas, U.S. Virgin Islands. And like most people, I am a huge Bob Marley fan. Um, so therefore, this book was of interest to me. I did not even know that there was an attempt on his life prior to hearing about this book and finding out that that was what the story was about. But it is, in fact, based on true events, even though this is fiction, it is a novel, but it is inspired by an attempt on the life of Bob Marley shortly before a concert he was going to give. And if you've seen the HBO film Guava Island, starring Rihanna and Corey Glover, I believe, that story seems to, in large part, also be inspired by Bob Marley and what he meant to the island and to the people, what his music meant to them, and the fact that there were certain people who were not so happy about his effect, and as a result, his assassination attempt in that movie as well. So, anyway, going back to my review of A Brief History of Seven Killings, um, there are quite a few elements to the story, as I said, that had me looking forward to reading it. And I stuck with it. And ultimately, I am glad that I did because Marlon James's talent is undeniable. Undeniable. He's a absolutely fantastic writer. Every one of the characters in this book rings true during their particular moments as the focus of the story. Sometimes it's a killer, sometimes it's like an FBI person, an agent who is trying to track down the killers. I mean, the narrative goes across quite a few different people. Um, the style in which it is written, it feels almost more like a series of short stories or scenes that are loosely connected rather than, a cohesive novel. And this choice by the author apparently impressed the critics because this book won the Booker Award. Though I do know that some readers rather, may be put off by that and they prefer that a book kind of just have a central story and stick to it rather than bouncing all over the place. Um, so I'll conclude by saying this is not a book that you casually invest time in. It's a major literary commitment. It does have a generous payoff. And I do recommend listening to Bob Marley's music if you can while reading this book because they go hand in hand wonderfully. And that concludes my thoughts on Marlon James's book, and I look forward to reading more from him in the future.